The attack on Pearl Harbor was seemingly successful, and Japan was celebrating this great achievement. However, the Imperial Japanese Navy was amidst a propaganda cover-up, as there was one aspect to the attack that had not gone according to plan. Not one of the 5 midget submarines had returned for recovery, and one of the crew members ended up being captured by the United States alive and became the first Japanese POW. In order to make the midget submarine operation seem better, the Imperial Japanese Navy, being aware that one of the submarines had sent a message that the attack was successful, decided to credit the sinking of the USS Arizona to the midget submarines. As for Sakamaki, the one submarine survivor who ended up being captured by the United States, his inclusion in any propaganda was removed, and his involvement in the attack was kept secret. Being captured so early in the conflict was a great dishonor, and he was to get no publicity for it. Not only that, his midget submarine, HA-19, also survived the attack, largely intact. HA-19 was spotted by U.S. bombers in the early hours of the 8th of December, and they dropped bombs on it, but missed the submarine. Over the course of the next week, the United States Navy would recover the submarine and transfer it to the submarine base within Pearl Harbor. Once there, the United States Navy would assess the vessel and determine its weaknesses and strengths, along with taking technical data from it if there was any use. The United States Navy found that the Japanese had an interesting method of assembly for these submarines, as they had assembled 3 primary sections, and then these sections would be bolted together. Undoing these bolts undid the section's connections, and this allowed the United States to examine the submarine without damaging it. Once the assessments were completed, the submarine was reassembled, placed on the back of a flatbed truck, and then it was put on tour throughout the United States in order to collect war bonds. Once the war was over, there was no need to use the submarine for war bonds, and so in January of 1947, it was put on display at the Naval Station Key West in Key West, Florida. In December of 1964, the submarine was moved to the outside of the Key West Lighthouse and Military Museum. On the 30th of June, 1989, HA-19 was put on the National Register of Historic Places and made a United States National Historic Landmark. In 1991, HA-19 was moved to Fredericksburg, Texas, where it would be placed on display within the National Museum of the Pacific War, and that is where it remains today. HA-19 was quite a special midget submarine used in the attack, as it was the only midget submarine during World War II that had a known identity, and its role in the Pearl Harbor attack was also known. That being said, it was not the only submarine recovered during the war following the attack, as on the 21st of December, a second submarine was recovered, and this was the one that actually entered the harbor and was sunk by the USS Monaghan. Naval Explosive Ordnance Disposal experts boarded the barge and examined the submarine, and they stated, the upper part of the front end was completely gone, there was nothing left of the tubes or the torpedoes. Below the tubes, the hull seemed to have blown outwards to where it was almost flat. This damage seemed to indicate an internal explosion had occurred, and in this area, the only explosive item was the torpedoes. However, according to the accounts from the attack, the submarine had fired 2 torpedoes, which would have meant no torpedoes were on board when it sank. Assuming the accounts are correct and both torpedoes had been fired, the damage the ordnance experts saw could be explained by the Monaghan having dropped depth charges. It's possible one depth charge scored a direct hit. The report continues. It appeared that the sub had been rolled completely over and the rear end of the boat had been bent badly out of line. Overall, the body of the boat showed the wrinkles and indentations typical of exposure to heavy explosions underwater. There was also a hole that clearly showed the path of a 5-inch projectile completely through the conning tower. The basic summary of the report was, the submarine was in awful condition, but there were no explosives worth worrying about on board. The United States Navy also deemed that the submarine was too far damaged to yield any use in an examination. However, its figure-8 net cutter and propellers were largely intact compared to HA-19's, so those features were removed. It appears that the submarine was entered, at least into the control room, and a few items were removed. Amongst the items that were recovered was the sleeve of a No. 1 uniform that included the rank of a full lieutenant. Out of the 10 men who were within the midget submarines during the attack, there was only one who was a full lieutenant, and this was Lieutenant Iwasa, and was on board HA-15. So, putting two and two together, that would mean that this was the wreck of HA-15. Unfortunately for the submarine and its two dead occupants, the sub was too far damaged to prove any use in an examination, and the United States happened to be constructing a pier alongside the submarine base. The submarine happened to be the perfect size for fill-in material, and it would be buried in the construction of the pier with full honors since its two occupants would remain inside. In 1952, the submarine was accidentally unburied. However, it was extraordinarily deteriorated from chlorine gas by that point, and so it was reburied in the same location. The badly deteriorated remnants of what was most likely HA-15 remains buried in Pearl Harbor today. As for the other three submarines, none of them would be discovered until decades following the war. On the 13th of June 1960, one of the Midget submarines was discovered within Kihei Lagoon. The wreck was discovered in roughly 75 feet of water, so it was rather shallow, and it was decided to recover the vessel. Preparations to recover the submarine started on the 6th of July, and the sub was raised on the 13th of July 1960, and it was found that its conning tower hatch was open, and no human remains were inside. The submarine was inspected, and this was stated. There was bent piping, a door twisted off its hinges, a large electric motor torn from its mountings, and much shattered glass, indicating that it had been depth-charged. Both torpedoes were still within their tubes, and so the bow section was unbolted and dumped at sea. Japan requested to have the remainder of the submarine transferred to Japan for further examination. On the 19th of June 1961, 20 years after it sank, this midget submarine finally returned to its homeland. Once in Japan, the submarine's wreckage was examined and several items were recovered, including a flight suit, a boot, a glove, and various tools. Based off the items that were discovered, it was deemed that this was the wreck of HA-17. A new bow was fabricated and bolted to the front of the submarine, and it was placed on display at the Naval Tactical School within Hiroshima, and that is where it remains today. The next submarine was discovered on the 27th of July 1992 by the deep submersible Peace-5. There was something unusual about this submarine, though. It was only the amidships section. The bow and stern were missing. After a little bit more searching, the submersible found the aft section of the submarine as well. Unfortunately, Peace-5's tracking system malfunctioned, and the coordinates to the submarine's wreck could not be recorded, but it was within the defensive area outside of Pearl Harbor in roughly 1,200 feet of water. Skip forward to the 5th of September 2000, and Peace-5 relocates the amidships section of the submarine it discovered 8 years prior. On the 29th of August 2001, Peace-4 was attempting to film and document the amidships section of the Midget submarine when it accidentally came across the bow section of a Midget submarine, and then later on it rediscovered the stern that had been found 9 years prior. There were a few early notes made about the submarine prior to it being realized that all three sections were from the same sub. The torpedo tubes were empty, the amidships section had about 15 feet of its length missing aft of the conning tower, and the hull plating was bent outwards aft of the conning tower. The stern, where the propellers and rudder guards were located, was badly damaged, and it appeared that the stern and bow section had been unbolted at their connections. Finally, there were cables connected to each of the three sections, which were not standard to the submarines. It also couldn't be ignored that the three sections of the Midget submarine were discovered within a United States Navy dumping ground amidst a bunch of amphibious vessels that had been damaged. So came the question, how do we identify what submarine or submarines these sections were from? Well, based on the time frame the sub was used, there were alterations that the Japanese had consistently made to improve the quality of the vessel's operation. There are 3 run-to locations that are exposed and easy to identify that could be used to identify the time frame a sub was used in: the net cutter, the pulley system on the forward end of the conning tower, and the rudders. Conveniently, all 3 of these items were intact and visible on the wreck, and all 3 sections were deemed to have been from the same submarine, and all 3 items were used only during the Pearl Harbor operation. Since this wreck does not have the torpedoes, it is believed that they were fired during the Pearl Harbor operation and the submarine sank later on. This would also make it the only midget submarine to keep contact with one of the fleet submarines, which was I-16, and so that in turn would most likely mean this is the wreck of HA-16. The fate of this submarine is not known. The last radio message that I-16 received said unable to navigate, and this submarine shows obvious signs of its scuttling charge having been detonated, and the sub was scuttled, as the hull plating curving outwards meant that there was an internal explosion. The missing section of the sub is also where the aft battery room was located, and that is where the scuttling charge was mounted. As for the submarine being in 3 sections, it is obvious that the United States Navy recovered it, and then eventually dumped it, leaving the cables connected to each of the 3 sections. Upon discovery that these 3 sections had made up the same submarine that participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, several theories were proposed as to what happened to it. The 2 most popular theories are that it attacked the USS St. Louis outside of Pearl Harbor and missed, or it entered Pearl Harbor and attacked Battleship Row. There was another theory that it had also attacked a destroyer, however this one is less common. Out of all of these theories, the only one that proposed that the submarine was successful in scoring hits is the one when it attacked Battleship Row, as it's believed it fired a torpedo at Oklahoma and West Virginia. Arguments for and against each theory is relatively good, and so it's not possible for us to determine what exactly this submarine did. Now, at the time that the wreck was discovered, it was also not known when the United States discovered, raised, and then dumped the wreck, but according to NOAA, which is a modern federal agency, the United States Navy found it in 1951, recovered it, and dumped it in the same year, but before dumping it, they had examined it and found that there was significant scuttling damage after the conning tower, indicating the internal explosion of the scuttling charge. After this examination was done, it was quietly taken out to the dumping ground and then dropped back into the ocean. Since 4 of the midget submarines have already been discussed, that leaves one to be discovered, and that would be HA-18, which was found on the 28th of August 2002 by PCs-4 and PCs-5 in 1,312 feet of water, 5 miles from the entrance of Pearl Harbor. Upon examining the conning tower of the wreck, on the starboard side, there was a shell hole at the base of the conning tower. For the first time in 61 years, the Ward's kill could finally be confirmed. It scored a 4-inch shell hit on the conning tower, which resulted in the control room flooding and the submarine sinking. A few notable features about this wreck is that both torpedoes, though heavily corroded, are still within their tubes. The submarine's periscope glass is still intact and visible. And finally, there is a major break in the hull at the connection point between the amidships and stern sections. It appears that the bolts gave way when the submarine contacted the sea floor, and this natural connection separated. Otherwise, the submarine is in resounding condition. With that having been said, the secrets of the Pearl Harbor Midget submarines were revealed, and the most likely identifications were assigned to each of the 5 wrecks. That means that there is nothing more to add on to this topic for today. So, if you have learned something new, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.